Are we all listening? A podcast brought to you by Cohere. Hello everyone and welcome to this podcast. This is the first podcast that Cohere is producing. We're very excited to have you here joining us. It's also the first podcast I've ever been involved in. My name is Edmund Page. I'm the CEO and founder of Cohere. And we're going to be talking about various topics in our podcast to do with refugee responses around the world, humanitarian aid. And in this series, we're focusing on the topic of Are We Listening? I'm very excited to have as my guest today an old friend, Kubana Alexis, who I'll let him introduce himself and talk about his story. We've worked together in the past, and Kubana is also now a member of the US board of Cohere. And so I think it's very fitting, Kubana, that you're our first guest today. And you could perhaps start by introducing yourself. I've known you during various different chapters of your life. I think it's fair to say you've, even in the time we've known each other for around 12 years, you've lived quite different kinds of existences. But perhaps you could, go back to the start. Tell us a bit about yourself, maybe starting from the beginning, right from your childhood, and just give us a bit of an explanation of how you got to where you are today.
Oh yeah, thank you, Ed. And again, it's great to be here. It's my first podcast as well. So I'm Kubana Alexis, and I'm originally born in Rwanda, and I grew up in Uganda. So I grew up in Uganda because I was a refugee, and all my years I went in different countries such as Rwanda, Congo, and Uganda as a result of different wars that were happening in the Great Lakes region. But really, to be honest with you, where I call home is Uganda, simply because that's where I was able to stay for a long period of time of over like 14 years. I have a lot of experience working with refugees and immigrants because it's now like the 16th year that I'm working on that I'm doing the same job. And of course, I was very fortunate enough, however much I was a refugee in Uganda and Congo, I was able to be able to know more about the work that refugees are doing and living that experience as a refugee by myself with my family. And the reason that's why I said Uganda is home is that that's where I really started getting involved, not only as a refugee, but also as a leader in various fields. And I remember my early years after completing school, I worked with Pan-African Development for Advocacy, that's PADIP. And then I think also I worked with YARID, the Young African Refugee Integration for Development in the early years. And I was both a computer instructor and also an English instructor by then. Of course, those positions I was volunteering because I wanted to give back as a refugee. I wanted to boost my fellow refugees and youth to be able to learn how to speak English, but also use the computer for the good cause. And I recall very well when Cohere, by then Xavier project was starting. That's when I got the chance of meeting you, Ed, and also with other guys at Yarid. I remember you had organized a social media training for refugees around 2012. I got involved, of course, because we were jumping in, because we were looking for different solutions. Whatever opportunities that we could get is what we could do. And people were learning how to use Facebook by then, how to write blogs, how to use Twitter, and how to even open a Gmail account, because majority of people, social media was new in East Africa, and majority of people didn't know how to use it. And the reason as to why I think you did that social media training was for people to be able to communicate with their fellow refugees or immigrants all over the world. So once the training completed, and we were like, what next? There's something interesting. How can we jump in? okay, we should continue this. And I saw that young guy interested so much. So do you want him to be on the board? If I'm not mistaken, actually not mistaken. I remember we are the first when I say we, I say Xavier Project by then. We were the first organization to train refugees in East Africa on how to use social media. And I developed a 1 month course. From that time, the rest is history because we trained over 1,000 people and they are all over the world now. So we developed this Tamka hub. The Tamka, which is called Tamka, is a Swahili word that also called speak out. And we called it Tamka hub. And also open space for other refugee-led organizations and also other local organizations to come and use that space, even like communicate, but also writing proposals, brainstorming. We hold a series of workshops and also were able to host a lot of events that are related to advocating and supporting refugees at large.
For those who may not know, the Yared and Kubana there is talking about Robert Hakiza and Cedric Marula, who at the time were running Yared together, and the area of Kampala being in Zambia, where this was based. Tamuka, meaning speak out, is poignant in the topic that we could come back to, actually, around the way refugee communities would speak about the issues they're facing in their day-to-day lives. And for around 2 years, as you say, we had these hubs for accessing social media for refugees to be able to speak out, as Tamuka denotes, and also a newsletter written by refugees, printed once a month in both Kenya and Uganda. You had experience working in that case in an international NGO as Xavier Project, which is now rebranded to Cohere, and also refugee-led organizations as well as other NGOs like PADIP. So maybe we could fast forward a bit, because you then were resettled to the US, which you also worked in NGOs on that side of the Atlantic. Maybe you could share a bit about how did you end up in the US and for how long have you been there and what's life been like for you there?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Of course, I lived in Uganda for 14 years and had that experience of working with refugees and immigrants. And the reason I wanted to give that story is that that really shaped the person that I am today. I got the news that I'm going to be resettled in the United States, Boston, Massachusetts. Of course, I think I told over my colleagues, my friends. Everyone was like, are you sure you're going to make it? Are you sure you want to go there? Are you sure it is the right decision? I was like, yeah, let me go and try it out. But I remember one of the advice they said that they were like, go, but don't forget what you started and what you were doing. So when I arrived in the United States, the expectation that I had before going, it was not the same when I landed at the Logan airport, because whenever, as a refugee and by the time you land at the airport, in the one of the US airport, your mind totally shuts down, because what you are expecting is not what it looks like. Because you come to this world that is working at a highest speed that I have never seen, and everything is calculated and is on time. The following day, it was different, because from the airport to where they had gotten a house for us, I could see, as you're coming out of the city within the airport and going to the suburbs, I could see the change of the house, how the styles of the house are. I was expecting to be in the skyscrapers, in a nice apartment. That's not what it was. And all of a sudden, I found myself in this small apartment where me and my siblings were going to live. For the first week, I was like, I need to go back. This is not the right place for me, because I felt like as if I was in a mourning situation, because I felt as if I had lost someone. But the people that I felt that I had lost is the community that I left behind. So I made my caseworker. We did the first initial intake assessment. Oh, they say, oh, you speak English very well. So we were supposed to enroll in the English classes, but I don't think so. So can you assist? So they were like, oh, that guy has experience working with refugees, so he should like be an assistant. It was challenging. It was challenging to me because I could not meet people that I used to meet. I could not do the work that I used to do. I said, you know what? My goal is to work with you in the same office. That's my goal, and I'm not changing the goal. So I feel like that confidence helped me like to work so hard to be able to continue working with non-profit organizations here. So moving the story up to now is that
Yeah.
currently I'm the Associate Director of Workforce Initiatives with International Institute of New England. He has been helping refugees and immigrants for over 100 years. I manage over 9 programs. I help people to get jobs, to get equipped trainings that can make their life better, and I expand the training programs. I negotiate. I get involved in writing proposals and decision making, and part of the leadership team. So it wasn't easy. Wasn't what I was expected. But the reason I started continuing doing it was to inspire other refugees who are coming in the United States, to show them that if Kubana did it, they can also do it. So you need to really work hard to reaching that phase.
Sure,
Yes.
sure. So the topic of our podcast series is Are We Listening? And it's a broad topic, and it can apply to many different angles of the humanitarian aid sector. Perhaps primarily one of the topics it could be applied to is the flow of funding, and also where power sits within the sector. At Cohere, we feel strongly about the movement for shifting power within the humanitarian aid sector. And I know that you do, partly in your role as one of our board members, but also through your ongoing work with refugee-led organizations. Perhaps you could speak briefly about that, and then I've got a question about how that could apply to different parts of your life as well. But could you maybe just talk about how you're still involved with refugee-led initiatives?
Sure. So before I arrived here in 2014, I had the opportunity of moving around. All those years, I had the opportunity of going to the refugee camps, refugee settlements in East Africa. And I found myself in a place called Rwamanja Refugee Settlement, where I met people like Eric, Matthias, Gakuru, Olivier, Hafasha, and others. And these were young youth who were just there doing nothing. And I remember I was doing a research about refugee livelihood, and they said, "Oh man, yeah, you live in Kampala," because I was an urban refugee. "You live in Kampala, you speak English very well. Can you teach us English?" I was like, we are doing a conversation in English." I was like, "Can we teach others?" I want you to teach others, not like us to continue learning English. They said, "No, I sure can teach others." I was, "Yeah, I can train you, and then you can train others." So from there, the reason as to why we did that is that there was a gap of communication. There was a gap of connecting with INGOs on the ground. There was a gap of refugee having a say in their day-to-day life and making decisions. I felt like if we started something as an initiative, it would really change people's mind. And by then, Guamanja was just starting, reopening, and then we decided to start a refugee-led organization called Tomorrow Vijana, so it means tomorrow's youth. And it is now 10 years. But when I arrived here, I was like, I'm not going to stop doing the same thing, because I was I was involved with refugee-led organizations since day one, like Yari, PPDR. I remember we switched our way of working at Xavier Project, and we started helping community-led initiatives that are led by refugees. And we set up like different community-led refugee-led organizations that were already existing and empowered them with what they really wanted to do. Like, for example, capacity strengthening, different trainings that would help sharpen where they want to go and what they want to do. So to come here, I continue doing the same work on a higher level, because I believe that where I'm sitting is where the decisions are made. Because when you look at whatever happens in Africa or to the refugee camps, and especially in Africa, is that most of the funding they get it outside from the INGOs. And I felt like the way of penetrating in that cycle is to be closer to those INGOs. And I feel like if you have that identity as a US citizen, it will be much better for you to be penetrating to such cycles and be able to advocate and also change their mindset. So that's why I'm still engaged in working with refugee-led organizations, and up to now, yes.
Thank you. And in terms of changing mindsets, if we could really drill down into what we mean by mindsets, what I'm really interested in looking at really three sections of your life and your experiences, to see what some of the differences you would see in the way that those communities you've been part of see the world, however you'd want to put it. And the three different sections or chapters in your life that I think would be really interesting is your experience as a refugee, in the early years of your life, part of a refugee community, which could be different nationalities. Your experience integrating in Uganda, as you did quite successfully, and sort of understanding that culture, which involves your leadership in different refugee-led organizations, but engaging in that sort of professional life in Uganda, but then also now living in the US as the third one. So of those three different viewpoints on the world, what would be some of the differences you can think of as to how those communities see the world?
So it's quite interesting because I feel like back here where I am in the US, we are more of like data driven and research based driven. We are not more of, we are more of like the outcomes and how it is influenced rather than like the actual cause of like solving on a day to day problem. So if you look at refugee communities in East Africa or Africa, is that it's more of like community oriented. It's more of like, let's do this together and solve this puzzle. Whereas here, you cannot do a project without making a research about it, without making an assessment and go and really make a research about it and say, okay, if we do this, we are going to be able to do that. So it involves a lot of technical skills and assumptions for even a project to exist.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But in Uganda or somewhere else in Africa or other part of the world is that it starts from the community within. A quick example I can give you, that's why when you said during COVID era, most INGOs ran away. They were nowhere to be seen because they couldn't figure it out. It's something that came abruptly that they were not prepared of. But sure. Guess who stayed? The people who stayed were refugee-led organizations. They were community leaders who came together and sat and said, what can we do? Okay, we are told that maybe we should move with precautions, we should wear a mask, but also we should still put food on the table, right? So community came up quickly to solve their own problems. And surprisingly, that's why I even find that a lot of people even didn't, I don't know how it was happening, but you find that if you look at the numbers in Africa, people were not really affected so much as was expected. So they were doing those precaution measures, but also they were still solving each batch because community oriented people work together. It's easier. Whereas here, an individual comes and say, I have done this research. This was supposed to be, and this is how I think it can be done. Mm-hmm. And yet, most of the time, it is wrong. It's also another example I want to give with that mindset, that where I see things different is that if I was born in the United States and then I happen to go to Kenya in Dadaab and stay in Kenya for like 1 week, automatically when I come back in America, I become an expert. because I've been there for five days, I feel like I've got it all. That's how it works. No, that's not how it works, because it involves a lot of layers. So I come and write this piece, a very big article or a very big book that people will read and understand, but practically that's not what is happening on the ground. So it's more of an individual and research-based and data-driven that read this world, this side. Whereas back in Africa or other parts of the world, it's more of like community oriented, and they sort of problem as it comes, but also they like working in togetherness to solve that puzzle. I'm not saying that it is 100% correct, but I'm saying that most of the time it works and it is solved because people feel like that sense of ownership. Whereas here, you don't feel a sense of ownership. I said I manage 9 programs. I know the budget that I use, but apart from that, I cannot even add. So, for example, I can be given a project of training 100 people to get to be placed in 2 jobs, right? If I'm given that budget or that funding, if we write that proposal and it goes through, I'm not going to train more than 100. I cannot even train 101 because of the numbers in the head, because of what we have said that we are going to do, because it is the principle, right? Whereas in Africa or with refugee-led organization back home is that I can come to Korea and they say, I want to train kids with disability. I want to advocate for kids with disability and make sure that they receive enough equipped training and enough materials to be supported at school. And I want to target 50. And I need this amount of money, right? However, Korea is kind enough of saying, okay, yeah, that's what you want, or go for it. However, if I come and I say, my target was 50 people, but I managed to reach out to 100 kids. My target was 50 kids, but I was able to reach out to 100 kids. Korea is going to see it as a success. Because I say, oh, how can you use those little resources that you have to reach to a bigger number and support a bigger cause, you know? Wherever here, it will be a little bit a failure because we are money also minded. We are scared that if we get this done with bigger numbers, fewer resources, we are not going to get more money. But back home, you get what I mean? We're not going to get more funding. Whereas back home, it is like, okay, we want to solve the problem and get it done.
And the impact might be harder to measure in numbers.
Yes.
And what I'm hearing from you, some of the words that jump out to me are individual, data and money, data and evidence. I sort of wonder, do you see a connection between the focus on individual progress and this obsession with data and outcomes, evidence, etc., coming from the West? Do you think maybe there's no coincidence that there's such a focus on the two always going together?
I would say I see that coincident about being individuals, but I don't. It's because of how the mindset is. You know, it is the principles that are set by certain individuals that it should be like this.
Okay.
The so-called experts. You know, but those experts now are not involved. They don't involve the refugee leaders or the refugee community. I feel like if they were involved, it would be vice versa. I could even so give an example. Proposal writing. Back then you needed to write to know how to write good English to be able to get even money. Of course, you would include numbers and the principles that people follow and the objectives. And the proposals were, even up to now, when you're writing a proposals, you are supposed to look at what they really like, what the funder wants. It's not what you want, it's what the funder wants. Sure. Which makes it difficult. But if we didn't get people like Korea or Resourcing Refugee-led initiatives that are coming and saying that there is this unrestricted fund, it is on this particular topic, what is your concept? Right? If we don't get people like that, then refugee-led organizations are going to go nowhere. So I feel like the individualism comes from the principles that are set by certain people somewhere, and that's how they want to run the show, which is completely a little bit difficult and wrong, especially when you want to support a refugee-led organization.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely the case that I don't know which comes first, the obsession with evidence and data or the focus on the individual. But having grown up in Europe, I now know on reflection that we do have an increasing focus on the individual, individual rights, etc. This is an idea that over the last few hundred years has become so forefront in our minds that we sometimes struggle to think about any other ways of working. And it was possibly at a similar period in history that we also became more and more focused in Europe on evidence, science, and trying to document everything that's going on and being able to codify everything on paper and being able to say this is what we've done and we can prove it using this scientific method. But actually, we also need to accept that's only one way of getting to the truth of something that's going on. But if you're very focused on evidence to prove what you're doing in the world and to prove your value in the world, then it makes sense that you're going to gravitate also towards data around individuals. How many people reached, how many people have benefited in what way? And when you try to express in what way they've benefited, it might still come down to numbers, like how much money they've been able to generate and revenue for their families, etc. And actually that brings me back to the point about money. I think for sure it is very difficult for anyone who grew up in the Western world to envisage value without some kind of attachment, financial attachment to it. And it's getting worse. The way you could even put a price on a view or spending time with your friends, and increasingly we're able to monetize almost every experience in our life. And I think we're just brainwashed in not being able to imagine other systems of thinking that could be out there. But from what I'm hearing from you in other periods of your life, there's definitely been a nuance or a difference in the way that communities think about change, think about a better future. Would that be correct?
Yes, there is a change that is coming because refugee leaders are stepped up. We have gotten chances of people getting resettled in different countries, like me, and other people are resettled, and we are trying hard to work hard to make that change, and letting the community be aware of their needs, be aware of their rights, and also we are trying to promote what we call equality and equity in what we are doing, not the vice versa. And also, I hate this message sometimes. It's what people. So how we are perceived is that we should be coming to a funder or a donor looking sad, or saying, you know what, we don't have this, we don't have that, we need this, we need your support. So the change is that we are now coming with the impact. By the way, in our community, we are doing A, B, C, and D. And he has successfully proven that it is working. By the way, we feel like livelihood is the best way to do it, because if you are promoted, if you are doing your livelihood very well, for example, if you are doing farming for business, you successfully gain employment, and you are self-employed instead of looking for a job somewhere else, right? So we are changing that concept by showing that yes, we are the right people to do the thing that we are doing. We have the right way to do it. Yes, you need the numbers, you need the impact, and this is how we can be successful. So that change is coming, but it's not an easy change, and also it requires you to have lived that experience to understand it. But also it requires refugee leaders also to connect with various people around, within and around the world, to be able to showcase what they are doing and how it is done and what impact it can bring on table. A quick example: Tomorrow Vijana was received the money to construct a community learning center, and with INGOs, I'm not going to mention the names, is that if you get funding to construct a community learning center, you will need to solve a big puzzle. You will need an expert to come and measure the land. You will need an expert to come and see if that real community learning center can fit there, the standard of it, and everything. Forgetting that if you gave that money directly to a refugee, we have experts, we have people who have been engineers, constructors, laborers, we have people who are designers and who can do each and everything. So we received money to build a community learning center, and it took us 3 months, and it was done by refugees for refugees. Everyone was involved that was a refugee. And we looked at the numbers, of course, back into the numbers, we realized that everyone earned like more than $160 a month working there as a refugee, compared to the $3 they give a family as a cash assistance. So that was a mindset and a change in the game, showing that okay, we can also do such activities instead of relying on INGOs to come and put this structure there without sustainability plan, without everything. But since the community is involved in doing that construction, then it means that there is an ownership. It means that they are going to protect it very well, and it means that there will be a big impact. But if we receive someone somewhere, say, I'm going to construct for you classrooms, or you can come and construct them, but if you do not involve the community, you might even find no one there. I see even young people, like there is a guy, this young kid that was even supported by Cohere, Xavier Project then to go to school. He's having a refugee organization called Chess Academy.
Raised Chess Academy, yeah.
Yeah, Raised Chess Academy in Nachivan. When I see that young guy, I feel like I'm crying because I remember him as a baby at Xavier Project, going to school in primary school and high school. But because of the nature of the leaders that guy grew up seeing, refugee leaders like us, he was like, I'm also supposed to do something to the growth of the refugee organizations and the work that they are doing.
Yeah, I think both of those are great stories, and I think the reason that it worked in both the case of Julian Axante with Raised Chess Academy and also Tamara Vijana's project of building the community center using community and local resources was that in those cases they didn't have to fit themselves into the agenda of a donor who might not understand the needs of that community. You mentioned that a lot of the time refugee leaders have to look like they're begging for funds. Another trend I've seen increasingly, and actually it's been there for a long time, but in some ways it seems to be getting worse at the moment, is this idea that local organizations need to adapt their funding proposals to align to donor strategies. It surprises me, 10 years into the localization agenda of trying to localize aid, to shift power towards people themselves affected by emergencies and crises and forced displacement, that we still use phrases like aligning to a donor agenda or to a donor strategy. We are assuming, of course, in the vast majority of cases, that the donors themselves do not come from those communities affected by forced displacement or the communities that they're trying to fund. So why do they have the agenda for change for that community? Why do local leaders need to adapt to meet the vision for a future that the donor wants to see? And I think what you've shown, which has been fascinating to me and also rings some bells with my own experience, including my own ignorance in the past, is that it's just simply not possible to understand the vision for change that a community affected by forced displacement would have, a different future that they'd want to see, without experience, basically. And it could be just by really getting to know the leaders, to hear how they express the needs and the changes that they want to see. Or it could be, ideally people with that lived experience coming from those communities like you, being able to build that bridge between the people with the funds and people who are looking for change. But there's really no other way. And I think what you talked about going and spending a week somewhere and then becoming an expert. The other type of expertise which I think fails to get close to the truth is research and needs assessments, because ways of trying to understand what's going on, ultimately you are still using sort of Western systems of thought, structure, and evidence building to actually get to the truth. And so that in itself becomes a limitation, a restriction on how close to a live truth you can get to, especially in an ever-changing world. And I think the example of an expert spending time in a community is a good one, because I myself lived in Kenya for 9 years. I've been away now for 4 years from my full-time experience of living in Kenya, and I just went back to Kenya again, and I had this fascinating experience, which is maybe for another podcast, where I realized that I really didn't understand, the community I thought I knew, and the way that the way they structured a normative paradigm about different values in society. I'd come in with as age 25, so brainwashed into thinking I understood, how communities saw progress, how they saw good and bad, so to speak, and that even after 9 years, I was still blind to really being able to be sensitive and understand that actually people just didn't see the world in the same way that I did. And I think it's this form of ongoing colonialism, and it's one of the forms of colonialism that's least understood, because even the people engaged in it are doing it unwittingly. I think a lot of donor agencies are still under the mindset that their paradigm for a better world is the only valid one. And that therefore it goes without saying that communities affected by emergencies and disaster will also follow the same paradigms. I think my biggest concern is that not only does it often miss the mark and get it wrong, but I think in itself, by getting it wrong, can do more harm than good, because from that point on, the donor's in the position of power whereby they have a strategy that needs to be achieved with the funds they've got available, and anyone downstream of that funding has limitations and restrictions in terms of how they work to achieve that agenda. And those restrictions end up cascading down. This could be a topic for our next conversation, is to think about how those restrictions and limitations, everything from due diligence to very tight reporting, monitoring, conditional funding, how it ends up being divisive to communities and causing potentially more harm than good, and also impeding the agency of communities who themselves have already experienced traumatic events such as forced displacement. Yeah, so one of my fears is that the increasing trend of donors setting the agenda and local leaders having to align their work to an agenda set by someone who's not from that community, is that as well as not being effective, these funding streams could end up doing harm. I begin to wonder whether, when a donor comes in with their agenda, the funding is conditional on that agenda being set. So everyone downstream, be they INGOs or local leaders, local organizations, are then restricted in what they can do to the extent that it meets that agenda. And that what that comes with is everything from due diligence to very strict reporting mechanisms, monitoring, also conditional funding, or funding ending when it is deemed that the strategy is not being achieved. And all of these things come with the side effects that could themselves be divisive, even corrosive. I think we could go into that in future conversations as well. I'm just wondering whether this is something you've experienced, when the donor's agenda ends up dominating to the extent that it could do more harm than good. Like, one thing that certainly happens is local leaders have their agency impeded. Yes, the project might be designed to create certain outcomes that might benefit certain individuals, but at what cost? If it's at the cost of the community, or if it's at the cost of the agency of that community in deciding their own futures. Has anyone really asked if that was a trade-off that community would want? What have been your experiences of restricted funding, whereby you felt that you, as a refugee, or also as a refugee leader, have been more trying to adapt and align to the agenda of someone who's not from your community?
Yeah, that's a good question, Ed. And I think with restricted funding, of course, sometimes it can create some good outcome. But as we go on with talking about localization and refugee communities and host communities and impact, it looks like it's causing more even harm than good, simply because you don't get the results that you really need as a grantee receiver. For instance, is that when there is a limit, certain restriction on what you're supposed to do, you don't feel comfortable enough to change things as concerns arise. I would give you an example. Again, I would go back to the COVID era. I would wonder all those refugee-led organizations or the organization that had grants of supporting X number of refugees or host communities. What do they do when they were not on the ground, right? So you realize that all the indicators and the goals that they had set, it was shut down because of the emergency that was arising. So having that restricted funding does not allow you to work comfortably, and also it creates even the trust between you and the funder goes down, simply because the funder is expecting you to get things done according to what you have said that you're going to do. And when you do it differently, then they say, now we have lost you. We have lost trust on you. Yet it's not the case. Things might have changed on the ground, and you need to solve things as they arise. So in one way or another, it's limiting the work that the refugee-led organizations are doing, and I hope this should change, and I hope we should more advocate for more of unrestricted funding instead of restricted funds.
Yeah, I think it would be really interesting in future conversations to unpick some of the problems with restricted funding and due diligence, and the lack of trust-based, meaningful relationships in humanitarian aid. And I think what we've identified is at the root cause of restricted funding. And so maybe if we to really go to the root cause and unpick it from there, is this continued idea that people with the funds actually know what's best for other people in other communities, and they are then reinforced in that viewpoint by some of the feedback they get and some of the research they get. But that still doesn't mean that is correct. And also, it doesn't take into account the implications of now the ways of working and the consequences of coming in with the funds, and also at the same time saying, I know what's right for you, and my funds are conditional on you living out the life that I see for you. And so I think this is what we've touched on as one of the problems today in the behind why power is not being shifted in the sector. But what would you leave as a parting message to anyone involved in the humanitarian sector based on this conversation, be that INGOs, donors, or anyone else?
So my message would be to be good, would go directly to the funders, and I would urge them. I would actually challenge them to be good listeners, but also to adapt where need is. To be adaptive, but also don't be forgetful. For example, is that there is a lot of emergencies that are happening in the world. The effective way of solving such emergencies and solving such situations is working collaboratively with refugee leaders and refugee communities and the host nations that are hosting those refugees and immigrants. So be good listeners, adapt, and be able to talk realistically and be open to changing instead of like staying on your principles. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Well, that's a good conclusion to this, is to be better listeners, and to think more holistically about what that really means. How do we listen on multiple levels, be ready to adapt? So I think that's a good place to leave this for now, because it gives us so many touch points to pick up on in a future conversation that I could imagine. So it's been wonderful having you, Kubana. Thanks so much for joining us on our first ever podcast. And thanks to you all for listening. If you'd like to learn more about the work that we are doing collectively, do go and check out wearecohere.org, and also some of the organizations referenced in this podcast, such as Tomorrow Vijana. We'd much appreciate if you could share and follow our work. So thank you for joining.
Thank you, Ed. Appreciate that.
Are We All Listening? A podcast brought to you by Cohere.